Thanks, everybody. Good morning. It's really great to be here. I'm excited to take you through this presentation. One thing I'll say is that when you have a presentation called choosing success over the Sarlacc Pit, you better give people a little bit of background on what you're talking about. So I have a podcast series called the Cybersecurity Effectiveness, little plug there. But I did a mini series within that focused on board members. As many variants of them as I could find. Board members for public companies, private companies, tech companies, finance, healthcare, across the board, and which is what this presentation is primarily based on, is those interviews and quotes that I pulled out from those folks. So I think we've got some interesting pieces that we'll share. But one of them that I spoke to said that when a security executive, primarily CISO, are presenting to the board, it's kind of like they're being sucked into the Sarlacc Pit. And for any of you that aren't Star Wars fans, that's from Return of the Jedi. And there's a scene where Jabba the Hutt's talking about it. And when you fall into this pit, you're enduring indescribable suffering as you're digested slowly over thousands of years. So pretty horrible. But the whole idea was, it doesn't need to be this way. It doesn't need to be this painful situation for both sides, for the board and for the security executives when they're having these conversations. And there's some things that can be done to improve upon that. And a lot of it, quite honestly, it's just perspective. It's really getting into the perspective of how boards operate, and not the bits and bytes that sometimes we talk about, or even the sort of the broader security perspectives, but understanding business risk and business impact and weaving that into the presentation. So, I always hear that, security executives are invited to present to the board and they're given an hour. And next quarter, they're only given 10 minutes because it was just too much information. They couldn't process it. The board members say, look, we've got 1,000 kinds of risks to deal with. Cyber is just one, and we just don't have the cycles to put into it. And that's not good for either side, because security executives should also be getting feedback and input from the board. It's bi-directional. So that's sort of the background here. Let's just jump into the my background, I guess, a little bit here. So as Kim mentioned, I'm Vice President CISO with Mandiant Advantage. I've been in cyber for about 25 years, worked in a bunch of countries across 6 continents. I started with DISA and then later Bell Labs. And then I just went on a tear of building a bunch of cybersecurity startups. I've had a couple IPOs, a bunch of acquisitions. I've written a couple books. My last one was with Bill Kroll. He's the former deputy director of the NSA. And General Michael Hayden and I did a cyber war documentary as well, not too long ago. So I've been in the space far too long. So I've seen a lot of things done wrong and some things done right. So hopefully throughout this presentation, I'll share some of those lessons learned as well. So real high level agenda. I just didn't want to show up and give you guys a bunch of quotes and say, here's some quotes, read this. So I definitely have a lot of quotes that we're going to pull in from these board members that I think will be valuable. And I try to pepper in some concepts around that. But I want to kick it off with something that I think is a little bit fun as well, which is a little bit of a historical perspective on technology and threats. And again, it's all about getting into this mindset of changing perspective, but just from sort of a nice evolutionary perspective on tech. Certainly the conversations with the boards, how it's business relevant, some of the hot topics, some of the things they hit again and again and again. I try to highlight those. Literally, I have those terms highlighted in the quotes, things like threat intelligence, some other pieces that come up a lot. And then finally, demonstrating operational competency, which seems to be one of the core requirements for everybody. So let's just jump right in. The first thing we'll do here is just a quote. So this is Art Coviello. Art is the former executive chairman for RSA. Brilliant guy. He's been a mentor of mine for a very long time. He's on the board of a publicly traded financial services company and a huge laundry list of tech and security companies as well. So I'll just read this so you guys don't have to read these quotes. But while board members don't need to be cybersecurity experts, they do need to be able to interpret risk metrics regarding cybersecurity, just like they do when they're understanding sales, operation, or finance. Only when there is an understanding of the risk can boards provide the most appropriate oversight and governance. And I think that's a really great quote to start things off with, because when we think about it, We've been asking to get security to have a conversation at the board ever since I've been in security. And a lot of that was hubris. Oh, we need to present. It's really important. There's this attack. There's this ransomware. We need to let the board know. And that's great. And finally, the board said, yeah, you're right. This is a board level topic. Let's have you in here. But boy, you better be able to support what you're talking about with actual facts and evidence and metrics, just like they do in sales and operations and finance, right? So if you went to the CFO and you said, hey, CFO, how much money is in the bank? And the response is kind of like we talk about ROSI, return on security investment, right? Well, we did some PCI audits and we follow best practices and we use MITRE ATT&CK and this and that. It's a little bit wishy-washy. And if the CFO comes back with that type of information regarding how much money is in the bank, they're probably not going to be the CFO very long. And we've gotten kind of a pass in this in cyber, just because there hasn't been a really good way to measure risk and effectiveness and report based on tangible facts, juxtaposed to some red team assessment that we did, or some security vulnerability, or a patching update, where we just measure our effectiveness based on vulnerabilities discovered versus patching or some other metrics like that. And while that's valuable, it doesn't really give us the data that boards need to make their decisions. Another thing Art told me, which isn't in the quote, but I'll reiterate here, is he said that today on a publicly traded company's board, the most powerful committee, I think most of you know boards are made up of multiple committees, everything from payroll committee, acquisition committee, and there's just a ton. But the most powerful committee today is the audit committee, which might not be that intuitive. And the audit committee has stopped asking security executives, do we have security controls in place to mitigate these risks? Because the answer these days in 2021 is always the same. Of course we do. We spend all this money, we have these processes, we have these people, but by the way, we need you to help us talk to the CFO to get another check so that we can get more technology and more people and more training, et cetera. And that really isn't flying anymore. Now they're saying, instead of, do you have this? They're saying, can you prove that all these security controls in place are actually doing what they're supposed to be doing? They're effective, they're adding value. And furthermore, can you prove that that money, that budget that you're asking for from the CEO or the CFO is something that's actually needed, and it can't be addressed with investments we've already made? So that's a fundamental shift, right? That's a really, really a big change in perspective, because now it comes down to evidence. Again, like sales and operations and finance, security is now a strategic business unit. So some of that history part that we talked about that I think is kind of fun. So if we look at civilization's advancements, and it'd be silly to think that we could fit them all in one slide, but I just cherry picked a couple big ones that I thought made sense. We've got cave paintings in about 20,000 BC. That was the sort of the first development that we have record of for humans, and alphabet and writing and paper and all these things. But every once in a while, there's a huge advancement. And a great example of this was in 1804. So Samuel Slater, Industrial Revolution kind of time period. This was Joseph Marie Jacquard, and he was in France, and he had invented this device called the automatic loom. And if you look at it, you can tell that's the predecessor to punch cards or punched cards. Both words are actually right. And what it was designed to do was make textiles, specifically blankets in this case. So for example, each one of those punched cards has a specific pattern that weavers would use. Now, in a very productive factory without one of these automatic looms, you'd be lucky to maybe do a dozen blankets, for example, a day. But with these looms in place, these automated systems that could work very rapidly, if the machines were working properly, you could actually make hundreds. And this is arguably underlined, the world's first computer. And it predates Babbage and the programming languages from Ada Lovelace. Because it had input, output, it had storage, it had memory. It's not a computer as we would think of today. It's certainly not electronic. But again, arguably, it was the world's first computer. But I think what's really, really interesting about this is the employees got a little bit nervous. They're like, look, this thing's going to replace us, because these factories are buying dozens of these automated looms, and then they just need somebody to operate the loom. What's going to happen to all of us? We're going to lose our jobs. So they snuck in one night and they actually destroyed these machines. They sabotaged them. Another historical footnote is, theoretically, that's where the term sabotage came from. But I've heard a couple examples where it might have come from other locations as well. But the point is, the world's first computer suffered an insider threat. all predicated on this newfangled computer, if you will. So when we have good, sometimes we have bad. When we have light, dark, front, back, you kind of get it. So as these technologies advance and do these wonderful things, every once in a while, something kind of negative kicks over. And then we see in the right-hand column, after ARPANET, we have things like TCP/IP, we have Ethernet, we have web browsers, search engines like Google, YouTube, Bitcoin, and other huge advancements. But the problem with this, again, the front without a back, you can't have light without dark, et cetera, is you're seeing that these are being taken advantage of. And I thought the best way to talk about this and how technology is taken advantage of is just look at really broad categories like sea, lands, or sea, air, space, et cetera, and look at the shrinking threat windows. So real quickly, about 3000 BC is about the first time that we used the sea for trade, or at least that we have records of the sea being used for trade, and that was in the Mediterranean Sea. The first recorded pirates didn't kick in until about 1300 BC. So theoretically, we have about a 1700-year threat window before someone said, hey, that boat going between this landmass and that landmass, why don't we just rob it? So that's a pretty long threat window. So then air. So we've gone from sea to air. So now in 1859, John Wise said, hey, I'm going to use this invention, the hot air balloon, to move mail and charge for it. And it was the first sort of consumerization of air. And it was a great idea. I think trying to exploit air, it crashed and failed. It literally crashed and failed. I think it caught on fire and crashed and failed. But we didn't have that first hijacking kick in until 1931. And that was in Peru. So again, a pretty broad threat window. Now we get into space. So a couple of years after Sputnik, we had a satellite called Telstar that was used by AT&T, and it was for television broadcasting. So that was the first commercialization of space. We haven't seen a lot of attacks or issues in space just because of barriers to entry. The juice generally isn't worth the squeeze, if you will, of trying to do satellite hacking. From a nation state perspective in satellite warfare, that starts to become a different story. But if we just look at commercialization of space and how it was trying to be exploited, there are some isolated incidents. And one was in 2015, that was with the Trula data theft. So it was basically a botnet that had command and control capability that was leveraging satellites. So pretty isolated cases, but still there were some, and the threat window there again is shrinking. And then we get to cyber. And the first commercialization of the internet was in about 1988. NSFNet had folks online and they would let them do email, and MCI Mail had people, they'd let them do email. And they said, well, why don't we charge our customers and then they can email each other? Looking at that today, it's like such a silly use case, right? So obvious. But the threat window there came down to just about zero. Even prior to the commercialization of the internet, we had viruses and other types of exploits that were either created in a lab or true threats through PCs and things of that nature. There was the Brain, the Creeper, but 1988 also had Morris Worm, which really leveraged the power of the internet and the inner capabilities, and especially R commands and finger and things like that to exploit devices. So the threat window really shrank. And we see that today for sure in cyber, that we don't have long threat windows anymore. Our threat windows are measured sometimes in minutes or hours or days. And we've seen how technology has shifted advantage a lot over history. If we take the Greek soldiers, if you ever saw the movie 300, of course. So about 323 BC, the Greeks ruled the ancient world. And they did this with iron and bronze, and they had that phalanx unit, which was the shields and the swords, and they'd fight as one unit, and they'd move forward, and they were very, very successful. So by today's standards, iron and bronze, not very advanced, and the idea of, pointy sticks in a shield, not really very advanced thinking. But back then, that ruled the ancient world, and it shifted because anybody that they came up across or came up against, they could take down very, very easily. Until the Romans came around, and they had this new thing called steel, and they had this sword that was called the gladius sword, which was actually a Spanish style that they had taken. But they said, look, not only do we have better material, but let's change our fighting process. Let's try not to fight these Greeks in a straight line on flat land. Let's fight them on hills, in the trees, in the rocks. let's go ahead and come around them and fight them from different angles and flank them, et cetera, et cetera. So they changed the processes as well. So by the introduction of steel, it completely trumped what the Greeks had been doing. So again, from today's perspective, this is very, very basic, but 323 BC to 120 BC, this was the new. This was the new hotness, right? And then we take a huge jump in history and we get into the 15th century Ottoman Empire, so modern day Turkey. So these were the Janissaries. And they weren't the first army to have muskets or gunpowder weapons, but they were the first to embrace it en masse. And they said, look, this is a game changer. And the biggest reason was it could take years to train somebody how to use a longbow effectively. It was very complicated and it was a slow process. Somebody can learn to use a musket probably pretty efficiently in a week or two. They might not be the best marksman, but they certainly know how to load it. They certainly know how to pull the trigger, and they certainly know how to reload it after that. And these weren't great muskets. They weren't rifled, so they just weren't fantastic, but they were certainly easy. And if you had them in mass, they were highly effective. So when you're fighting somebody that's coming at you in leather armor, or maybe even chainmail armor, and they're standing in a straight line and waving flags, hey, we're over here, they make a really easy target. So that completely changed warfare because they saw the value of this and embraced it. And if we look at something that's a little bit closer to modern history, we take World War II, for example. And if anyone's ever seen the movie Fury with Brad Pitt, it's kind of plays in some of this, and you can see where some of this fits in. But a little background: in World War I, France and England had thousands of tanks, and Germany had about 20. So they didn't really feel that mobile armored warfare was the way to go. Fast forward to World War II, they went from having 20 tanks to 160,000 tanks and other armored vehicles. So clearly they thought there was a lot of value to that. And they actually built it very discreetly without letting the rest of the world know that they were building these. And there's a whole other story to back end that, which I don't have time to cover. But the whole point of this is their tanks were great. The Panther and the Tiger tanks were way more advanced than what was being built by the Allies. The U.S. M4 Shermans, the Russian tanks, they paled in comparison to the capabilities of these German Tiger and Panther tanks, for example. The problem was it took a long time to learn how to operate these tanks, one. Two, if something happened to these tanks, they were built like a finely tuned clock, which means if something breaks, it's hard to repair in the field. So you need a great supply chain to, have the people, one, that can repair it, and the parts to go ahead and make those fixes. So while it was more advanced, it was so complex, it was hard to operate. At this point, the US M4 Shermans, if you could drive a car, you could pretty much drive a tank. And the Russians, they were pumping these things out. They weren't painting them. They weren't putting chairs in them. And usually the person building the tank was the person that was driving the tank later on. I mean, they were just churning these out so quickly. So it just became sort of a operation of attrition at that point. But complexity is what destroyed these tanks. And thankfully, the war went the way that the war was supposed to go. And they were not triumphant with this design. But now we're seeing that cyber is this great equalizer. And I always love this quote by Samuel Colt. He actually didn't say this. His PR agency said it, but we'll go ahead and give him credit for it. He said, God made man, but Samuel Colt made them equal, in reference to the Colt revolver. So, you could be someone that's 100 pounds up against this behemoth person that's, 300 pounds, and they're coming at you. If you've got a Colt revolver, you're probably going to be more successful than the person without one. Well, we're seeing that with cyber as a huge equalizer, right? It's inexpensive, especially juxtaposed to enriching uranium or building a tank or a nuclear submarine. Low attribution. If someone fires a gun or fires off a missile or something, you could probably forensically determine where that came from, what was used. With a cyber attack, it can be much harder. It's easy to do. Again, not to say that hackers and people that are building these attacks in nation states, that these attacks are simple. But again, when you're comparing it to something like building ICBM or something, yeah, it's easier. The other part is you don't need to be a nation state to launch a very effective cyber attack. You probably need to be a nation state if you're going to have stealth bombers and satellite warfare. But you could be a terrorist group, a splinter cell, minor actors, things of that nature, and still be successful. And finally, it compresses space and time. So a bullet has a finite range. A missile has a finite range. A cyber attack really doesn't, as long as there's some type of connectivity. So that really made cyber this massive equalizer that has changed everything. Now, if we think about technology in general, and it's time to reach people and how interconnected we are and how quickly and how fast things change, just look at some of these stats here. Time to reach 50 million users, right? Took airlines 68 years, credit cards 28 years, computers 14 years, again, to reach 50 million users. YouTube 4 years, Facebook 3 years, Twitter 2 years, Pornhub 19 days. Bit of an anomaly. But again, it's happening quicker. So as new tech is rolled out and adopted, the number of people that it reaches increases substantially, which then opens up potential risk as well because of that exposure. And the last example I'll share here is a lot of these folks that are behind these nation state attacks are actual cyber criminals. So they'll do nation state attacks by day and they're cyber criminals by night. And the reason they can do that is they're in countries that offer them safe harbor. So if you attack, just don't attack us, don't attack our friends, but do all the financially motivated attacks you want. And then what will happen is every once in a while, we might call upon you to help us out and do some type of politically motivated attack or go after something that won't yield you money, but will help us. And that's sort of the quid pro quo there, if you will. And this is not that dissimilar to the Pirates of the Caribbean, not Johnny Depp, but the real Pirates of the Caribbean, which is about 1650 to about 1750, roughly, in the Caribbean. And essentially, these pirates would be on these islands like Nassau, for example, in the Bahamas, and they could stay there and they could do their pirate stuff, training parrots, making peg legs, pirate stuff. But more importantly, they could take all that treasure that they stole, all that booty, and they could sell that. And it allowed them a place to live and operate and conduct business safely. But if the English or the Spanish or somebody else came by that threatened these islands, they would call upon these pirates to go out there and try to blow them up and keep them away from the island. So that's that safe harbor. And again, that's what we're seeing today. And again, all of this is about perspective. So let's do another Art Coviello quote here. Art says that all companies, big or small, public or private, must embrace cybersecurity as a key issue with today's threat landscape. If you don't, you're not meeting your fiduciary responsibility. I love the simplicity of this quote from Art because there's so many things that a board member does that comes down to fiduciary responsibility in terms of what they're doing, whether it's an acquisition, whether they're talking about moving business to a different country, whether they're talking about releasing a new product. There's a lot of fiduciary responsibility conversations in that. Cyber has now become a key component of that for both public and private companies. So that's really a game changer. And again, there's not much more to say about that, but fiduciary responsibility, and that's a perspective that board members, even up until maybe 5 or 6 years ago, hadn't really fully embraced. They knew about cyber. They haven't been living under a rock, but they didn't treat it at the level of fiduciary responsibility. That's changed in the last half a decade. And the other thing we're noticing is it's not really about cyber risk when you're having conversations at this level. And this is a very, very simple twist on it. But according to these board members, it's about the financial, the brand, and the operational risk derived from a cyber attack. So when you're talking to a board about cyber, you're actually talking about financial, brand, and operational risk derived by cyber. So it should be framed in that context. That way, the risk could be understood in that context because, trust me, they're always talking about financial, brand, and operational risks, right? And cyber is an impact on that, so that should be discussed. Now, this is really evident now if you look at some of the CEOs you see in the news, especially, I think it's interesting when you look at power and energy and oil and gas, maybe not the most obvious group to come up and say, hey, cyber is a big deal. We're going to talk about it. But just like these oil and gas companies talk about terrorist threats, economic issues, military problems, political strife, earthquakes, you name it, cyber is one of those issues. And now you're seeing them on the news talking about cyber. And it's not because they woke up one day, I don't think it is, and they said, hey, cyber is a huge issue. I think we should all just start embracing it and talking about this. They had to. Stakeholders and shareholders alike demanded it. Customers demanded it. Partners demanded it, that they take cyber seriously. They talk about it. It shows up in annual reports, corporate governance documents, committee charters, on and on. It's in these publicly available documents for these organizations. And again, You expect it maybe from financial services and healthcare and things like that, but now you're seeing it even in power and energy, which tends to be a little bit of a later adopter when it comes to cyber. And even they're publicly talking about this because they have to, because it is a actual risk that has to be addressed. So evidence measures, again, we talked about this earlier. Evidence measures for cybersecurity have to be in line with finance and sales and operations and other strategic business units. It has to be based on evidence. And another interesting concept that came out of this is there's about 6 priorities that executives tend to care about as it relates to security. And they're very, very basic. We might try to pull things out like ransomware and things of that nature, but it's a little bit of a broader perspective. It's things like securing communication, things like email, right? I need to be able to communicate securely. Protecting my financial systems. That's a key one. That's absolutely pertinent that we make sure our financial systems, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud, are protected. Customer data and intellectual property is protected. Assuring the availability of my critical apps in my infrastructure. So all those critical applications, all the infrastructure supporting those applications, I need to be able to access them. Safeguarding access, meaning that only people that should get access have access. And then finally, demonstrating compliance, not just placating auditors with a checkbox, but being able to say I'm addressing privacy and legal and regulatory mandates as well. There weren't 50 things. It kind of boiled down to these 6 across the board that were hit again and again and again in these conversations, which is why I included that here. This is Alexa King. Again, she sits on a number of boards, but what's really interesting about Alexa is not only being somebody that has a lot of security savviness, that she's a lawyer. So she addresses or approaches issues with that mindset as well. And Alexa says, if you provide boards with evidence-based, and we're going to see this word a lot, evidence-based data regarding your cybersecurity posture, trends, intelligence, effectiveness, we'll see those words a lot, they should be able to provide you with valuable input based on their broader perspectives. Again, this is a key bit. And the reason I wanted to include this quote, again, it's not unidirectional. It's not let the security team pump a bunch of information to the board and hopefully the board is now more aware and they can make better decisions. It's what can I get back from the board to help me based on the fact that they sit on the board of probably multiple companies. They have a bigger picture maybe than I have. They're interacting with more business units, other customers, supply chains, partners, on and on. So hopefully they can then feed back into me, hey, you're talking about this issue, but if you think about this from a broader perspective, maybe we can address this. So that bi-directional communication, and as legal gets more and more involved in these conversations, I think you'll see this need for this bi-directional communication, because legal, at least the legal experts that I've spoken to as part of this interview series and prior, have really been proponents of saying, look, it's a give and take. It's not do A, B, and C. It's, what do you think we should do A? What's the feedback? What's the back and forth? Okay, let's move to B. So it very much comes down to having the experts chatting with other experts within their own areas. And here's one that comes up a lot. This is the whole issue of business relevance. And when talking with the board, there's nothing more important than being able to talk about business relevance. And that's why this one got its own slide. So across all industries, businesses are relying on their critical assets to generate revenue, deliver services, be competitive, drive value, you name it. I don't think that's a aha moment. I think most people get that. But it's a significant investment, right? And you want to ensure that it's protected. The other one is business continuity. I need access to the data, to my customer services, to my critical infrastructure. Regulatory compliance, again, the laws, the regulations, the accreditations, the privacy concerns, all these things come into play. And then critical asset protection, again, my intellectual property, my customer data, my financial data, all these bits. And then rationalization, optimization. And this, I think, is probably the most important out of all these. It wasn't until maybe 4 years ago, and it might have happened before, but about 4 years ago, the first time I met somebody with the title VP of Security Rationalization, and individuals that were actually part of a rationalization team. And the sole purpose of this team is to say, we need to be able to rationalize that the devices that we've invested in, these critical assets, are actually providing value. Now, it goes back to what we talked about before from Art Coviello with the auditors and what they're saying. They're not asking, do you have devices in place to protect critical assets? They're saying, can you prove that the devices that you have are protecting critical assets? And that's about rationalization. And rationalization can help you prioritize, where do I need to invest next? Relevance and my understanding of where we are from a security perspective. Business rationalization. Can I retire? Do I have some overlap? Do I have some devices that I'm paying maintenance and support on that I simply don't need anymore? And what can I do to get rid of those devices? And maybe then I found a big bucket of money and I can use that money to hire more people, conduct more training, buy tools that I need. What are the devices that I have that maybe I'm only getting like 20, 30% value, which is, to be quite honest, is about what most organizations get from their tools. They spend $1 million on a device, maybe they're getting $300,000 worth of value. Not because it's a bad tool or they have bad people, but optimization can be really, really challenging, especially historically. So these are the things to keep in mind when having those conversations. Business relevance. How is it relevant to the business, and how can it help the business be more successful? This is Matt Biggie. Matt is a former military officer in the Army, sits on a ton of technology and security companies. Really, really great person as well. Matt says, when I see boards, executives, and auditors and security teams successfully achieving good governance hygiene, part of that success is usually a result of cybersecurity leaders being educated in the fundamentals of business risk management. Again, there it comes again, security people understanding the business risk. They understand the types of data, the evidence, the reports, et cetera, that the business needs. I can't stress this one enough. As I talked about earlier, security executives get invited to the board to present. For the first time, they get an hour. The second time, they only get 15 minutes. Not because what they're saying isn't important, because they're missing the mark in terms of how they're presenting it based on the evidence and the reports that leadership actually needs to see. And again, it's being able to speak the speak of business risk management and not just the security bits and bytes. Those are great. They add color, right? I'm all about those pieces of flair that you can throw into that. They sometimes are eye-opening and use cases are valuable, but it has to be framed in the context of business risk management, which is something that not all security professionals are trained in. A lot of them came up through IT or system administration, network administration. They came up through a different path where maybe they didn't get that much exposure to business risk management. And that's something that can be learned. The broken security formula. So I mentioned a little bit earlier some of the companies that I've helped build in the past: ArcSight, Imperva, Solaris, Cylance, McAfee. All those companies, I believe, had great products, especially great point products. The problem was, and for all of them, and companies that I haven't been a part of, is getting those solutions optimized so you're actually maximizing the value, the investment that you've made in those devices. Again, did you spend $1 million on this tool and you're only getting $300,000 from this tool? So the formula is security investment plus effort should equal my security being effective. But that's not how the formula is working. And we publish a report every year, so called the Security Effectiveness Report. It's got lots of great stats, but it's based on how effective are actual security controls across endpoint and network and email and cloud security controls. And just a few stats, I didn't want to throw a ton up here, but there's about 70 different security vendors per organization. I've actually been to some banks that have over 200, which is insane. But even 70 is insane to think you have that many security vendors. And maybe for some organizations that's right, but it's a lot. It's a lot of devices to keep running, let alone make sure they're optimized and providing value. Sometimes we're happy just to get the car running, let alone get it on the racetrack and win the race, right? There's about 35% overlap we see as well, which means that 35% could be retired, and that money can then be used to invest in other more critical things, hiring, training, better tools. And about 80% of the time, there's under configurations or misconfigurations. And again, this might not have been something that happened the day you deployed it. Maybe it was working great the first day, week, month, or even quarter. But because of environmental drift, rules changing, signatures changing, network infrastructure changing, you have these problems that arise that make something that was effective less effective. This was blocking or detecting or alerting or correlating, but now it's not. So now I'm not getting the value that I was. So it really starts reducing the level of value that we get from these investments. And again, when talking to the board, it's all about value. This is Jay Leak. Jay Leak is a co-founder of Clear Sky Security, which is a venture capitalist group, but he was also the former CISO for Blackstone, which is a very large publicly traded real estate holdings company. So Jay has that perspective from both sides, both being a VC and, of course, being a CISO as well. And he says boards and business executives can generally quantify risks brought on by economic downturns, political changes, natural disasters. But understanding preparedness and impact analysis for cyber is often based on assumptions because of a lack of evidence-based measures representing the effectiveness of cybersecurity countermeasures. Again, it's not enough to say that we're patching, we're doing vulnerability scans, we did a red team. It's important now to say, how effective are my security tools? Do I have evidence to back up what I'm saying, that this is working, this isn't working? Can I actually show my effectiveness trending up or trending down based on investment changes and things of that nature? So again, it all comes down to this notion that assumption-based security is dead. This whole idea is that I assume based on this audit or this red team exercise or this new tool we bought or this new training that we've been through that things are working the way they should be. Instead, I'm saying, well, I'm validating my people, my process, and my tech. And through this validation, we're determining what's working, what's not, what we can do to fix it. And once we've fixed it, put something in place to automate to make sure that thing that's fixed stays fixed in perpetuity. And that's really where we want to get today. I think automation and cybersecurity have to come together because the risk that we're trying to address is untenable to try to manually address the effectiveness of security controls these days. Some common security findings that we see across the road. We keep on talking about security effectiveness and evidence-based measures. I'll just use ArcSight as an example. I was with ArcSight for almost 7 years, so from pre-customer through the IPO. So I kind of saw the whole growth and maturity of the SIM space. And it was a very interesting space where we said, look, we're going to suck in a bunch of logs. It's going to correlate. We're going to spit out some great results. But anyone that's played with SIM knows because it's a superset of everything else you have in your organization, it can be a challenge. That's probably the nicest word I can use. Issues from NTP and parsing issues, and the fact that these syslog servers were reporting to the SIM, but IT threw up a proxy server. Now syslog's being blocked. Nobody let the security team know. Or we had bidirectional taps on our IPS and they were working great, but somebody hit the wrong button and now we've got unidirectional taps. And because of that, the IPS is dropping everything because it needs bidirectional traffic in order to create something. So you can do all the volumetric analysis and temporal analysis and anomaly detection and pattern discovery and write all these rules. And God knows I've written thousands and thousands of these things. But at the end of the day, if everything reporting up into that SIM isn't actually correct by the time it gets there, it's going to be garbage in and garbage out. And then you have to, when you're writing these rules, let's say everything is working perfect and there are no NTP or parsing issues or anything else, and it's great. Things can change, right? Vendors can change the way that logging is being done. You used to get 50 fields from this firewall, and now you're only getting 20 fields. And there's one field that takes the place of all those other 30, and everything's stuck in there and it's common delimited, but nobody communicated that from the vendor. And there's a billion issues like that. But once you get this and you're writing these rules and you think everything's working great, you have no way to validate that it's working. How do you know that this very complex correlation rule or temporal volumetric analysis is actually going to work without actually executing an attack safely within your environment to validate it's doing what it's supposed to do? And once it is doing what it's supposed to do, you need to be able to does that again in perpetuity by testing it once every hour or once every day or once every week to ensure that thing that was reporting and detecting and preventing and correlating continues to do that. So we see a lot of issues with that. With SIM is a great example, again, because it's a superset, but it applies to email, network, cloud security as well, which is why it's so important to be able to test your security effectiveness. And that can be done with tools like breach and attack simulation, security validation tools, even red teaming engagements, although that's a little bit of a microcosm because it's just a snapshot of a point in time as opposed to over long periods of time, but it's certainly better than nothing. But to actually validate your security controls, not scanning for vulnerabilities in Oracle and Apache and seeing what your patch level is, but actually validating the effectiveness of those security controls. And you do that by safely executing real attacks within the production environment. And in doing so, you can address those issues like weak out-of-the-box configurations. When most people deploy a product, whether it's a partner or whether it's a vendor, it's usually kind of shooting for the middle. I don't want to be too loud, so the results look like it's going to overwhelm the security team. And I don't want to be too quiet, so it looks like you're not getting any of the value. And that's probably fine for a POC, but it's not fine for production. Unfortunately, most organizations run out-of-the-box default configurations. Because of this under-configuration and lack of people to actually go out there and help address these issues, they tend to stay in that state. Also, you have a lack of resources post-deployment to actually tune and keep these devices running. You have segmentation flaws. I see a lot of this in critical infrastructure. A can talk to B, and B can talk to C, but C should never be able to talk directly to A. More often than not, C can talk to A, and it wasn't supposed to be able to happen. And that quote unquote air gap or whatever control that was supposed to be in place simply isn't doing what it's supposed to do. We talked about the SIM issues and outdated signatures, no awareness of what vendors have changed. And also, there can be an inability because of so much data to distinguish between malicious activity from maybe legitimate activity as well. So again, a lot of this comes down to tuning and validation of the actual security controls, not simply vulnerability scanning and patch management of the assets they're actually trying to protect. Matt Biggie again. So audit committees evaluate a wide range of risk from standardized accounting practices to the composition of boards. Okay, we talked about all the different committees on boards a minute ago. In cybersecurity, historically, the audit committees have lacked controls effectiveness evidence, validation measures against threat intel, and threat intel, again, a popular topic, and optimization metrics for incident analysis and response capabilities. Lacking these key data points results in the audit committees being less effective at measuring and managing risk. So the first thing is, we don't want anybody to be less effective at anything. We want them to be more effective. So hopefully, if cybersecurity teams can do a better job, these committees can do a better job. And if these committees can do a better job, hopefully the business and the cybersecurity teams can do a better job. So it all wraps around into this notion of controls effectiveness. So we've been talking about validation and making sure your security controls are working, but here's the first time we've seen it tied into threat intel. And this notion that threat intelligence doesn't have to be a lagging indicator of compromise, something that you use for forensic analysis or some feeds that you're getting from various disparate vendors. It's fine to have multiple sources of threat intelligence, but you want to be able to personalize and operationalize that threat intelligence to make use of it and ensure that I'm actually testing my security latest, greatest attacks, as well as the old stodgy stuff that still gets through. But I want to make sure I'm testing against these IOCs. I'm testing against the new, this new APT that we're seeing out in the wild, or this new flavor of ransomware, or command and control, or whatever the attack might be. And by doing that against the latest threat intelligence, again, now it's giving me that edge. So I'm saying, yes, we are up to date. And when the boss calls and says, hey, I just saw something on the news or in the paper about this latest attack, where do we stand? You can come back with empirical evidence that says, well, this is where we stand. We tested against this specific attack. We're preventing here, we're detecting here, we're alerting here, but we have some gaps here. These are the compensating controls. Respond based on evidence, not assumptions, based on that specific attack. And that's really a game changer. And again, that brings you to that level of sales, operation, and finance in terms of accountability, makes security much more strategic. Now, when we're talking about security and this whole idea of breach and attack simulation, security validation, doing red team tests to perform this, again, this is another case where it comes down to perspective. You don't just want this firewall goes faster, this IPS has more signatures. We kind of want to rethink how we're treating our security tools. And a lot of this is measuring our tools, rationalizing to make sure that they're actually effective. So some of the key steps are, one, can I identify the gaps? Is this firewall blocking this attack? Is this IPS detecting this attack? Is this SIM correlating and alerting on this attack? If it's not, those solutions should tell me what to tune. Once I've tuned them, I want to be able to provide assurances that that tuning actually worked. So I want to rerun that attack to then validate that that fix I made is actually still providing value in perpetuity. Then I want to mitigate environmental drift. I want to make sure that everything that's been running in my organization is operating as should. And if something stops, I can manage by exception to mitigate that environmental drift. This was blocking, this was alerting, this was correlating. And if it stops, send me a message so I can go ahead and investigate that and find out what happened. Oh, somebody opened up a clear text protocol port. Oh, somebody stopped sending in syslog messages. Oh, there was a change in my infrastructure. Now I can rationalize. I can very simply say what's working, what's not, how do I prioritize, where do we need more investments? I can go to my CFO or my CEO and say, I need budget for X. Here's the evidence why I need budget for X. And if we don't, here are the ramifications of that. That's something that they understand. Then I can map to things like MITRE ATT&CK and NIST and SANS and OWASP and all that. And I can create reports now that are understandable and digestible from executives and boards. And most importantly, as a security team, I'm actually now able to demonstrate value. I can actually show what the security team is doing and the value that they're bringing to the table, which is always nice to be able to say, look, this is what we do. Isn't this great? Here's Julie Cullivan, very, very smart lady. She's been an executive with a ton of security companies, Forescout, McAfee, FireEye, a bunch of them, and sits on a lot of boards. But she said, most wouldn't argue that automated, proactive, intelligence-led approaches to cybersecurity is where we need to move as an industry. Absolutely. We talked about automation and intelligence a ton so far. However, most organizations don't have the resources to maximize that value. Yeah, most organizations don't have a big threat intelligence team. Usually it's cybersecurity is doing it. This is another case where leveraging third party can then utilize their platforms and experts to help provide services to enable intelligence-led approach to be successful at scale. Okay, here's a case where we're talking about services augmenting your solutions. And MSSPs and security services have been around since security has been a thing. But it's really getting sort of some new shoes now because organizations are finding that we simply can't scale. We can't hire enough. We can't retain enough. We can't train enough to meet these threats by ourselves. We shouldn't have to do it all, right? Just like we're not going to hire our own police force. We're not going to hire our own fire department. In some cases, we have to depend on these experts and leverage that as a service. Well, the same thing is we're seeing a lot of this in threat intel, being able to leverage threat intel experts in addition to my threat intelligence feeds, being able to leverage experts behind security validation in addition to having my security validation capabilities. So it's an augmentation of these capabilities. And I really firmly believe that this whole idea of services plus solutions is going to be the way forward. Again, just to scale, to address the problem and take advantage of the expertise that these organizations have. Now, sourcing intelligence, since we're hitting intelligence pretty hard in this conversation, I'm a big fan of organizations leveraging intelligence from multiple sources. So at Mandiant, we think we've got some great threat intel. I think some of the best. But there's also free sources of threat intel. We have a freemium offering. There's aggregators. There's other paid for services. There's stuff that you can get from your ISAC. There's malware traffic analysis and sites like that. We can download a malicious PCAP and test it out in your environment. So there's a lot of sources. And it's great. It's great to have lots of sources of intelligence. But some of the things to keep in mind when you're looking at these is size matters. So look at how many sensors organizations are running. There are hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of sensors. They're people. Do they have dozens of people, hundreds of people, thousands of people across how many countries, supporting how many languages? Again, size matters in this. Data analysis. Again, when they're doing their analysis, is this based on people that have been schoolhouse trained in intelligence? Is it people that have an average of 10? Or is it some security people that are kind of interested in threat intel and have kind of been tasked with this job? Again, volume is really, really key. Even if you look at detonations, like how much malware are you detonating? Are you detonating a couple hundred a day? Are you detonating thousands every second? What are the stats? So big fan of getting intel from multiple sources, as long as you can personalize it. So it's relevant to your organization, operationalize it. So test it with automated controls to see where your security controls stand against these TTPs, these IOCs. But try to ensure, and you might have some threat intel that's very specific and it's very niche, and you add that to the mix, absolutely do that. And maybe it's even free. Take advantage of that. That's why I say people should really leverage our freemium capabilities too. But you also want to look at groups that have that broad volume, because volume, again, is an area of threat intel that's just so critical. This is Bill Kroll. So Bill and I have been friends for a very long time. As I mentioned earlier, we actually wrote a book together, but he was with the NSA for over 30 years and has some amazing stories. And he also today sits on a number of boards. So just brilliant person, a lot of great insight. So if anybody knows anything about threat intelligence, the guy that was with the NSA for 30 plus years tends to know a lot. But he said, having an intelligence-led approach to cybersecurity doesn't just make the security team more effective. It provides the evidence leadership needs to ensure that your goals, objectives, and priorities are aligned with their business requirements in the face of the latest relevant threats and threat actors. I love this quote because this notion of intelligence-led, again, Intel not being a lagging indicator, but sort of being the tip of the spear, taking that latest threat intel, validating my security controls against that, and then going ahead and making sure that what I'm doing is aligned with what the business needs. Because maybe I'm using that latest threat intel and I'm validating these controls, and I've noticed that this company that we just bought in this country has controls that are very, very weak and could then have a negative hit on us, right? So these are some of the things that need to be looked at. But this whole notion of intelligence-led, I think, is probably one of my favorite. And we're talking about intelligence-led. I just wanted to expand on this with this whole tip of the spear idea here. Is it should be relevant. If I'm a financial services company, I probably am not that concerned about attacks that are specific to oil and gas SCADA equipment and PLCs, right? Is it personalized? Can I go ahead and take advantage of that threat intel to validate my specific security controls? What are my safety levels? Am I able to operate at a very high level of safety when doing this testing? Or is it putting my organization at risk? Outcome awareness. I need to know in some cases that I'm not going to be able to fix these issues. So what's the outcome awareness? If we were to be compromised, this would be the risk. Would it expose customer data? Would it bring down my critical communication channels? Or any one of those 6 issues that we talked about at the very beginning that are critical to executive teams, financial systems, critical infrastructure that are supporting those financial systems, customer data, email communications. Can I create reports predicated on the threat intelligence, again, based on how secure my systems are and how they're operating? And what does my security spend need to be? Do I need to go ahead and invest more, or do I have the right amount invested at this point? Here's another one from Jay Leak. It's a long one, so I'm not going to read the entire quote, but he said, boards in the C-suite are recognizing that software with a service, and that's sort of a new term to some people. There's software as a service, but software with a service is the future of cybersecurity. Technology-led platforms augmented by security and operations experts. So again, this whole notion of I want to have great security platforms on-prem or in the cloud or some combination thereof in a hybrid, which is usually the case. But in addition to that, I want to be able to be in a situation where I'm able to leverage experts. So software with a service. And I really, really think, again, whether it's threat intel or security validation or managed services, that these two things are coming together a lot, and boards are looking for this. This is a conversation that's happening with a lot of these board members. And then finally, demonstrating operational competency. It all comes down to this notion that I need evidence-based communications, not assumption-based. I think we all agree that assumption-based communication is dead. It never really worked, but we just kind of accepted it because there was nothing better. I need to know what's working, what's not, what needs to be done, and in what order. I need to be able to demonstrate trending analysis. How are we performing over time? Are we trending up? Are we trending down? How am I progressing in terms of specific threat intelligence? Based in the eyes of this latest threat intel, are we doing good or are we doing bad? Risk to partnerships and supply chain, system health, total cost of ownership metrics, effectiveness of not just my technology, but my teams and the processes that they operate, and budget planning based on facts, actually being able to plan my budget, not on some theoretical bad stuff, but actually on real intel, real attacks, validating my controls. And how can I make this all relevant to the C-suite and board? So when we talk about demonstrating operational competency, these are some of the things that these tools should be able to help during these conversations. Here's Karen Nortman, again, sits on a number of boards, a lot of very, very young cloud-based security startups as well, so some great insight. But she said companies are embracing cybersecurity services at an increasing rate. Again, we're seeing services again. This trend will continue to intensify. Augmenting your cybersecurity controls with teams and SaaS solutions with specialized experts means greater security ROI and reduced risk. Again, just another example of leveraging security expertise in addition to great products. And some final thoughts here, and then I'll get to some of the questions that have been coming through. Security it's strategic to the business. We've been saying this for decades, but I think now it's pretty much understood by all, including board members. But the other side of that, the good with the bad, the front with the back, that we talked about earlier, is that, boy, we better be able to measure things based on evidence like other critical business units if we want to be taken seriously and given an audience at this level. So security does have to be strategic, absolutely, but we have to be able to communicate with the rest of the C-suite that might not be security or even technology savvy, certainly not the level of a security team. The C-suite and boards are demanding more, right? They want the information, but they need that information sent to them in a relevant way with no guesswork. There's absolutely zero tolerance for guesswork and assumptions at this level. They need the good and they need the bad as well. You don't want to sugarcoat anything because they need to be able to make key decisions. Long live evidence-based security. One of the common themes we kept on seeing pop up was evidence-based security, threat intelligence led, leveraging services. These are all things that I think are the new. They always say, what's the next big thing? I've done enough security startups where I'm like, okay, what's the thing that's coming around, not next year, but in the next 4 or 5 years? This is what's trending hot: threat intelligence, validation, services that augment services with a platform capability to leverage that back-end expertise as well. This is where it's going. And the final thing to think about here is it's not about tools. We've been talking a lot about tools here, but being able to validate your people and your processes, not to say that Mary's better than Bob or this or that, is to say, why is Mary better than Bob? Does she have access to more tools, better training? Are her processes different? Does the process that she follows, has that been updated where the one Bob was following hasn't been updated and that makes him less effective? So being able to measure the effectiveness and continually test and validate your people and your processes along with your technology is really, really critical in this game. There's over 100 interviews that you can check out on the Cybersecurity Effectiveness podcast. I cherry picked just a few quotes, or else we would be here for a week kind of going through these. But you can listen to each one of those interviews with the board members that were here, for example. I think most of the interviews are about 45 minutes long. The one with Bill Kroll might be a little bit longer. When you're in the NSA for 30 years, you have a tendency to be very verbose in a very good way, but he's got a lot of information there. But check out some of those interviews. I think you'll find them really interesting. And if you're at all interested in checking out the podcast, again, it's the Cybersecurity Effectiveness Podcast. You can find it on Spotify, iTunes. There's the link at the bottom, but probably the easiest way is just to do a search on that. And with that, I'll get to I guess we're almost out of time, but I'll try to get to one or two questions here. About this one says, what are some security products or tools on the market that are doing something innovative and new? That's a good one. I think there's a lot of products out there that are doing interesting things, but again, one of the ones that I'm really leaning towards now, especially based on these conversations, are products that are augmented with services and expertise, right? So this notion of I'm not just buying a product, whether it's breach and attack simulation, security validation, threat intelligence, XDR, you name it. But I have some expertise and services backing that up that I can rely on and take advantage of that. And there's a number of, Mandiant, we do some of this, but this isn't a sales pitch, but there's other companies that do these types of things as well. But I would look at products that aren't just buying this thing, whether it's in the cloud or on-prem or both, but buying this thing that's augmented with some level of expertise and services. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things back over to Kim.